So.
Well, say, I don't want to segue just yet, but I do want to tease the audience because if you look at Rob looks, 45 years old. What his next project he's working on is about longevity, and it gives some tips to folks in a cheat code. Rob is actually about 105 years old, something like that, with working with Steve. And
it's not the age, it's the mileage that matters. I've experienced, Kurt. So
I was going to say, that's where you're supposed to say, thanks, so great to be here, Kurt. I'm going to make this better.
If I do applause, maybe sometimes Zoom kicks in and starts emphasizing the clap.
A few moments later.
Go for the thing that got me exposure to one of those two goals. And my career, oh, there we go. There's the Zoom thing.
I didn't do that, by the way. Zoom did that on its own.
I didn't either.
Welcome to Unlocking Moves, where we want to cover those key pivotal moments and decision points that really change the lives of successful entrepreneurs and leaders. And I want to hear their stories because I think we learn the most from stories. But I don't want to hear just their glory stories. I want to hear their gory stories because, as I like to say, the bigger the shit show, the bigger the lesson. I am super pumped about my guest today. His name is Rob Adams. He's not only a friend, he's also an entrepreneur, an investor, an author. And the reason he's a man after my own art is because of one of the book titles that he wrote, which is entitled A Good Hard Kick in the Ass, Basic Training for Entrepreneurs. I love that title. Hey, Rob, before we get going, I know you know that I like to hit my guests up with an off-the-wall question or comment to really keep them on their toes, keep my audience on their toes. You ready for this?
Go for it. I think so.
All right. For the last 20 or so years, you've been at the University of Texas, where you started and led Texas Venture Labs, which I know ran business competitions and had all throughout the year. And I know you've seen some great ideas, some great companies, some great entrepreneurs who have come out of that. But tell me about one or two, I'll say chaotic or crazy idea, a batshit crazy idea that came to you like, man, this is never going to work. And then maybe it turned out being pretty good at the end of the day. We got a reason for asking.
Yeah. Well, big admission here. I was, in about 1996, 1997, about 1999, 2000, I ran a fund for Austin Ventures, a fund that specializes in seed and startup, which is a lot of the book, Good Hard Kick in the Ass, was based on. And although I was not part of the decision-making process at the time, we did talk to Kolodnik and Uber and said, yeah, okay, not quite sure it works. And not only that, not quite sure you're the right guy. So, good, bad, or indifferent, we chose to pass.
Hey, it happens to the best of us. I love that. In fact, that was going to be my example. When I'm doing business plan competitions, I do a lot of it at high school and some at college. I used to question their ideas thinking, oh, this is never going to work. But if you had told me, 20 years ago, I was going to get in the back of somebody's shitty Prius at the airport, I would have called you crazy.
Yeah, well, the other thing, I wasn't against the deal simply because, I'd spent enough time in Asia. And at the time, actually, for the last 5 years in Singapore, they basically had Uber. You kind of had this phone app that, you dialed up and a car showed up. And, by the way, they also had things like a universal toll tag that when you went into a parking lot, you got charged. They had a lot of really cool transportation things, but one of the things that was working really well was an Uber equivalent. So like all great ideas, they weren't the first ones to do it. They were the first ones to do it, right and at a global scale. So,
let that be a lesson to entrepreneurs. I know we're not officially into the podcast yet, but let it be a lesson. You don't have to come up with your own idea. Maybe borrow or steal one from another industry or another country or another vertical. I mean, lots of ideas.
When it comes to that, I love to talk about Apple. Apple has not invented anything. They just take something that everyone's already using and make it a little better. And, they slowly make it better and better and better till eventually they've kind of taken over the world. So yeah, we could go on and on about that.
Well, Rob, that's what you're going to do with my podcast today. You're going to make it slowly better and better by being here with me today.
Sounds good.
As you can tell, my guest today is Rob Adams. He is currently the executive partner at Alumni Ventures. He spent the last 15 or so years at the University of Texas, as I mentioned, working and teaching entrepreneurship. He's also been a software executive. He's been an entrepreneur himself and an institutional investor. And as I mentioned earlier, he's written at least 3 books. So I can't wait to dive into what he's done and what he's doing currently. So welcome to Unlocking Moves, Rob Adams.
Thank you.
I was going to say, that's where you're supposed to say, thanks, so great to be here, Kurt. I'm going to make this better. Your
Yeah,
show
yeah.
sucks.
If I do applause, maybe sometimes Zoom kicks in and starts emphasizing the clap.
Perfect. Hey, usually I start with someone's story. I want to get the background and how did they end up where they were. Let's talk about some unlocking moves. We're going to get to that part, but I'd like to almost start with where you are now. For the last 15 or 20 years, you've been working at the University of Texas, teaching entrepreneurship. You're an entrepreneur in the past. You're doing entrepreneurship type things today. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing with Alumni Ventures and the whole world of entrepreneurship.
Sure. Well, Alumni Ventures, a lot of people know about it. It's the largest U.S. venture firm that focuses strictly on individual investors. So majority of venture capitalists, funds are institutional funds, endowments, UTIMCO, University of Texas Investment Management Company, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, American Cancer Society, every major university has an endowment, and that's usually what most venture capitalists invest. And that actually, back in the AV Labs days, that's what we invested too. We took money from Dell, from, a lot of Adams Street Capital, a lot of institutional investors, and put the money to work. Around about the Obama administration, I believe it was the Jobs Act, they changed the criteria for venture capital. The issue around venture capital is it's a high risk asset with substantial returns, right? The old risk reward payoff. So the government in its infinite wisdom thought individuals shouldn't do this because there's too much risk of capital loss. But at the same time, if you look at the track record on this stuff, the returns are phenomenal, and institutionals, investors were the only ones who could get it. So that changed, and Alumni Ventures kind of stepped into that void, and that's where we specialize. And then within Alumni Ventures, there are 40 or so funds. I manage 3 university funds, one University of Texas at Austin, which I started, Ring Ventures, which is Texas A&M, which I started with Larry Warnock, and then most recently, New York University, where actually my grandfather went to, long story. But so we run the partner on those 3 funds, which means I'm ultimately responsible for raising the capital and putting it to work. And then I'm part of the larger umbrella of Alumni Ventures, which is common in the financial industry, a holding company. Like if you look at Fidelity, Schwab, Blackstone, BlackRock, they're all corporations with multiple funds underneath them. Alumni Ventures is the big, sort of holding company, and all these funds are underneath it. If that
So
makes
is your
sense.
fund just University of Texas graduates or alums, or can I be, if I'm not a Texas grad, can I be part of the fund?
Yes. So it's not exclusive. What we like to say, friends and alumni of the university. It's not a strict requirement. And, actually all our funds are open to, anyone who wants to invest in them. And then also we focus on University of Texas management teams inside companies, but not an absolute requirement, because ultimately we want to produce a good return. So long story short, because we're dealing with individuals, we need highly diversified funds because we're usually their only venture exposure. So we make sure, we kind of check all the boxes as far as diversification. So for example, University of Texas has a relatively new medical school. Dell Medical School has been around for 7 or 8 years now, I think. Still not a lot of startups coming out of that. So the last time we did a deal, we did it with Harvard Medical School. We did a deal with the Harvard Fund. I understand Harvard has a pretty good medical school by reputation anyway. So we said, that's fine. We're in that deal, and it made a lot of sense for our diversification purposes to have exposure in that category. So we got our hands on the best deal we could within the alumni network. So.
Gotcha. So you're invested in other alumni venture funds as well.
Yeah, just to clarify, not other funds, other deals. So when we invest, it's our fund. We're not investing in a fund that invests in a fund. So, there's no fee stacking, so to speak. We're making a direct investment from the Texas fund or the separate A&M fund or the separate NYU fund. And, we're going straight on the balance sheet of that company. We're not embedded inside anything, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. So previously you ran the Texas Venture Labs, which is entrepreneurship to students. I'm imagining that you're seeing some of your alums come across your desk at Alumni Ventures. That's got to be pretty fun.
Yeah. So, Texas Venture Labs was a program for graduate students at the University of Texas at Austin based out of the business school. And at the time, Bob Metcalf was doing the same thing for undergrads out of the engineering school, if that makes, so we were both cross campus. And, the good news about what I got to do was, first of all, I got to work with a lot of, I got to teach in the MBA program. I taught entrepreneurship, venture capital, how all this stuff works. I really enjoyed that. Plus, I taught an elective, so nobody had to take my class. They wanted to take my class. And then also taught in the executive programs and so got to deal with all kinds of seasoned people. And as you probably know, all MBA programs require people to have work experience. So these people knew what they were doing. They had exposure. They wanted more about venture capital. And again, it was an elective. So I got to work with a lot of entrepreneurs, subsequently have backed some of the teams that I helped get through, their MBAs and their investment competitions when I was running that program at UT. Yes.
That's awesome. In fact, that's where we first met, probably in the mid 2000s, 2005, 6, 8, something like that. Our friend Ron Kesler introduced me to you, and I think I was part of he calls it a wisdom cluster, which is bringing some, mentor-like minds to folks and have them bounce ideas off of an advisory board, basically.
Yeah, and also, by the way, Rod Kurtz, our mutual friend, was back in the days of Inc. magazine. He was also a regular judge at the investment competition, and Inc. magazine, back when magazines were a thing, used to cover it quite well. So, and we used to, the winning company used to get, I think it was free advertising in Inc. magazine and on the cover and stuff like that. So it's a good program. It got University of Texas's MBA program. It was ranked about 20th in entrepreneurship when I got there. And then by the time I left, we were always in the top 3, typically behind Babson College, where I actually got my MBA. So, we did very well in the national rankings based on the results of the program. So
awesome. That's fantastic. If you're just joining us on Unlocking Moves, today's episode is brought to you as usual by HireBetter, the strategic talent partner for growth-minded entrepreneurs everywhere. Now, speaking of Rod Kurtz, so he mentioned to me the other day that you had maybe some interaction with Steve Jobs, and maybe I think you might have mentioned Bill Gates. I'd love to hear some stories about some of those. Were they? I'm sure Steve probably came through your business plan competition as a student at one point or something, right?
No, Steve did not. But no. So I was lucky early in my career, way back in the 1980s, way back in the last century. Boy, am I dating myself. I got an engineering degree and I went to work for Lotus Development, which was kind of the king of spreadsheets at the time before they got wiped out by Microsoft. And 2 things. It was 84, 85, 86. I can't remember exactly what year. And Apple was rolling out the Macintosh. And Apple was rolling out something called Apple Talk and the laser writer. So there was this nationwide rollout. And I worked for Lotus, and we had come up with a product called Jazz, which was, sort of an integrated spreadsheet running on the Macintosh. And Apple, it's hard to explain. Apple was kind of the stepchild of the industry. I was trying to think of a good analogy.
That's probably a good one.
They were the redheaded stepchild, and they desperately wanted corporate credibility. Now, they were big with artists and creative people, big on campuses because they offered a significant discount. They were somewhere maybe kind of where Elon Cybertruck is, or maybe Donald Trump is, depending on who you are. Meaning, it's like, who are these guys? What? So they lack corporate credibility. And what we gave them, because we were the corporate standard for spreadsheets, we built a product. So they wanted to emphasize Jazz as part of the rollout. And I was young enough, naive enough, and I raised my hand and said, I'd be glad to do it, that I kind of followed the Apple team around rolling out, the Macintosh, Apple Talk, laser writer, and modern, I was the guy up on the Diaz rolling it out. John Scully was the CEO at the time. This was before he fired Steve Jobs, but also Steve was involved with it. So it was quite an experience, particularly for somebody who was, a young pup in his 20s at the time. So
that's awesome. I remember, speaking of credibility, in 1994 or thereabouts, I went to work for Ernst & Young, And our first computers were I think it was called the Classic. It was the one that was about
Right.
2 feet tall.
And it
was
came in the big boxy bag.
we carried that to our clients along with a portable printer. So our laptops were, about the size of a, desktop.
That was
these
a
days.
huge credibility deal for Apple too. Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
That's
And I
awesome.
stayed in touch with a bunch of Apple execs after that, and I'm still in, you know what I mean? It's just interesting to see how far the company's come, how far it's evolved, how much different it is. So,
Well, say, I don't want to segue just yet, but I do want to tease the audience because if you look at Rob looks, 45 years old. What his next project he's working on is about longevity, and it gives some tips to folks in a cheat code. Rob is actually about 105 years old, something like that, with working with Steve. And
it's not the age, it's the mileage that matters. I've experienced, Kurt. So,
well, you look great. And I do want to talk, and you're not really 105, but I do want to talk about the longevity here in a bit. But before I do, I know that University of Texas was attracted to you to come in and launch Venture Labs because of your background. You had been an institutional investor. You'd been part of Austin Ventures. You'd been an executive, as I mentioned, an entrepreneur. Tell me, was that it? Like the whole package? Like what drew you to academia?
well, it was about 2006, 2007. We had raised two successive funds for AV Labs, put them to work, and then it was right before it was before the '08 crash, but it was pretty obvious things were getting pretty bad. We had a hard time raising a third fund. Actually, I left AV and went to raise a third fund. Had a significant anchor investor, but could not close the rest of the deal. So I was like, okay, I'm persistent, and I don't, I'm competitive, but also I'm reality based, as you have to be in a startup. And I could see what was happening. So a friend of mine, Gary Gaden, was running something called moot court competition, University of Texas. I had participated in it, much like you would participate in some of the stuff. And he said, hey, why don't you think about coming over here? And I had an engineering undergrad, I had an MBA, and I had a PhD, so I was qualified to do it. And I said, sure, what the heck? I'll spend 2 years. Anyone who's been in entrepreneurship, you need a recovery job every once in a while, kind of recharge your brain. So I spent 2 years there, but then interesting story, a guy named Tom Gilligan became dean of the business school and really did a terrific job. And he decided to focus on, I believe it was 3 things. One was entrepreneurship, second was consulting, and the third, I believe, was energy. And he called everyone in Austin and they said, hey, man, you already got the guy to do entrepreneurship. He's running your programs. Why don't you just, use him? And that's exactly what happened. We took the moot court competition. We enhanced it significantly. We turned it into a series of classes. We made it cross campus. And he was really, so all of a sudden, it was my chance to do a startup inside a big institution. If you want to know what a big institution is like, try working in a university. It's about the biggest of the biggest. And the main thing, just, slight side note, all universities understand is raising money to fund your own program. And I was fortunately, with Tom's help and many other people there, able to raise a lot of money for Texas Venture Labs, primarily John Brumley, who I'm still close personal and professional friends with, gave us a lot of money. And we were really able to run a significant program. And that's how we're able to increase rankings and all that kind of stuff. But it was very interesting, being independent, highly competitive, highly aggressive guy in the constraints of a university environment. And thank goodness for Tom Gilligan and a few other people who helped me out quite a bit. So it was ultimately a very successful program. But I do have to say the best part about it was just getting to work with students all the time who were just, highly energetic and charged up and had a lot of good, sometimes crazy, but very good ideas. So yes.
And I can only imagine how fulfilling it is to work with students who are doing special things, and they're really excited about what they're doing, especially as you mentioned earlier, they're not required to take your course, and trying to do it within the confines of a behemoth organization with a lot of bureaucracy and whatnot. I don't think I could do it. I'm pretty sure I'm unemployable by the university systems, but it sounds like a lot of fun. And your 2 years turned to 20, so you must have had a lot of fun.
Well, yeah, actually 2 years turned to 12. So it was I tacked an extra decade on there. Yeah. But it was a great learning experience for me. Again, I'd say primarily navigating a huge bureaucracy. The politics of our university inside are everything you've heard, but worse. I love Henry Kissinger's quote, which is the problem in academia, the politics are so thick because the stakes are so low. And you know, that's the best summary I've heard of it, but it was quite an experience. But again, you know, the students, the success of the program and the results of the startups that came out were just more than made up for the 10 or 20% of the job that was somewhat of a drag. So
Nice, nice. So I do have one follow-up around that top part of your career. You were at AV Labs and Alumni Ventures prior to that. Any good stories you can tell me about Kevin Lalonde or Vernon Bryant?
oh yeah, well, I got all kinds of stories, particularly on Kevin, but you know, honor requires that I respect their privacy.
Oh, come on. That's no fun. That's no fun. Okay. Well, let me shift gears. I want to talk a little bit about, it's a book that you wrote many, many years ago, but I mentioned, I love the title, A Good Hard Kick in the Ass, Basic Training for Entrepreneurs. There's a couple of quotes in there that either are attributed to the book or maybe people that read the book. One was, I have $1 million business idea for a new product. And then they also, the concept of business porn. So the first one sounds like everybody's comes to you, they've got a great idea, or I already had that idea, I can't believe I didn't start it. It's basically the difference between idea and execution.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, you know, so what separates a dreamer from an entrepreneur is the entrepreneur is grounded in reality. And, you know, it's really, you know, entrepreneurship just grabs people and gives them sort of superpowers. And the challenge is a lot of times people it's a good idea in their own mind, and that's about it, and they won't listen to any reality. And unfortunately, that's the majority of people who call themselves entrepreneurs. And you're really, you know, one of the things you learn about venture business is you have to know when to disengage quickly. And, you know, one thing my experience would, you know, if I count late 90s, what we're approaching 30 years of experience doing this is, you look for the people who are grounded in reality, are enthusiastic, aggressive, excited, but intellectually honest about it. You know, everyone's got a great idea. Everyone thought of an idea that somebody turned into $1 billion blockbuster. But the fact of the matter is they didn't do it. So until you go and do it, it's, until you kind of have your head bashed in, you really don't, you need the light of day to come through to these ideas. And the problem is business born, as I wrote in that book, you know, if you pick up Fortune or Forbes at the time, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, it sounded like he fell out of his dorm room bed at Harvard and became a billionaire. And the reality is he was about a 15-year overnight success, right? It took a long time, a lot of tough stuff he went through, but everyone thinks it's easy. And the key to it is venture capital. And the reality is any good entrepreneur knows that venture capital is really the last resort to get your idea off the ground. If you're really good, you don't even need venture capital. So I've sort of hit on a bunch of things there, but what I'm trying to say is you got to be grounded in reality. You have to know when to listen. You have to be aggressive and persistent, but you also have to know when it's time to throw in the towel and do the next opportunity. And just to wrap it up, what I used to tell students was, listen, if the average startup has a 20% probability of succeeding, let's use some sloppy math. This is not statistically accurate, but how many companies do you need to start with a 20% probability of succeeding, right? The answer is 5. So if you start number 1, would you rather spend 10 years on number 1 or 2 years on 5? And I tell everyone, spend 2 years on 5. So figure out number 1, give yourself some 2-year goals. If you haven't met them, drop it, go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one. Statistically, by the time you get to 5, you should make it. So that was sort of a whole bunch of big ideas rolled into as quick a response as I could give you.
I love it. That's good stuff. And I'm reminded of the 15-year overnight success story. There are so many companies and people think that you're successful. It must have just happened overnight or you got lucky or whatever.
And the other one I always hear is, oh yeah, this company, you know, Nuco Inc. is doing exactly what we're doing. They just raised money at a $200 million valuation. I'm going, yeah, but you guys don't have any revenue. So why should you get a $200 million valuation? So, that's the business porn stuff. You read about it. It sounds like everything's easy, and it's just not. It's the hardest, most arduous thing you ever end up doing, as anyone who's been through it knows. So.
Well, you just touched on something that I want to raise for our audience, and that is this idea of raising money on a, as you said, $200 million valuation. That money is used to try to grow the company. And just because you got a large valuation doesn't mean you're cashing any checks just yet. And it just means the next raise or sale has to be even more than that valuation. So the work begins when you get the check, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And everyone wants a high valuation, and there's a couple things around that. Number one, that means you got to live up to the valuation, as you just said, and produce more for the next round. That's one thing. The other thing is, I'm a seasoned venture capitalist, and if I want a deal and they want a high valuation, I'll give them the high valuation, but I will make up for it in the terms and conditions of the money. So, valuation isn't everything, for sure.
Yeah. Well, we could do a whole podcast just on the venture capital industry and how we can navigate it, because I know there's a lot of good things in there that you could. In fact, let's plan on doing that at a later date.
Sure,
all about venture capital.
Absolutely.
All right, so I want to ask you about what you're doing today, but I think this is a good segue into what I call someone's unlocking move, because there's a couple of things that you said there in the world of entrepreneurs that I think fits. So I'd like to uncover what your unlocking move might be, which again is a key pivotal moment or decision point that really changed the trajectory of your career. Many things could come into there. What are the one or two that come to mind?
Yeah, you asked me this a while ago when we were talking about doing this podcast, and I had this epiphany, and, it was in my late 20s, and a couple things. First of all, in college, I was a competitive rower, and our coach was really sophisticated and actually trained us the way you would train today, but he knew this stuff way back in the 80s. And one of the things we did a lot of was visualization, right? Just thinking about, okay, what do you want? Okay, if you want to win, how are you going to do it? You know what I mean? And just very simplistic stuff. So I was always a big believer in that. And when I got out of undergrad, I kind of would write down my goals. What did I want to do as far as work? What did I want to do as far as income? By the way, I never took the highest paying job, but I probably made the most money because the one I took was a startup that didn't pay that much until the huge checks came in because they went public. But I always was sort of believed in visualization and having big, simple, long-term goals as far as career and family and health and all the other stuff. But I remember distinctly, I was in my late 20s. I was getting ready for work one Monday morning. I remember it was Monday. I was married. I had one young son, and I was bending over into my closet, picking out my black tassel loafers because everyone wore a suit and tie, back those days. And I said to myself two things. Someday I'd really like to teach, and someday I'd really like to do venture capital. And it just hit me like a lightning bolt. It was like somehow restating the obvious to myself, but I had never seen it. But a couple things here. This was back when nobody knew what entrepreneurship was, right? People thought I was crazy because I went to work for a startup. Nobody knew what entrepreneurship was. Nobody knew what venture capital was. Anyway, so I was in a venture-backed company. Eventually, I left Lotus, started my own venture-backed company. So, that was sort of a natural progression. And then immediately, after that day, I wrote to the place I'd got my MBA and asked if they had any openings for adjunct teachers. And to my utter shock, they said, absolutely. We have this position. Do you have any experience in high technology marketing? It's exactly the job I was doing at Lotus. So all of a sudden, it was sort of a real simple epiphany in the middle of a lot of chaos and, career and family and traveling around the world and, trying to keep things going. But it was just so clear and kind of became the rest of my life. Anyway, so that was sort of the unlocking move. And all I did was simply whenever I was looking at something at work or something, I would always go for the thing that got me exposure to one of those two goals. And my career, oh, there we go. There's the Zoom thing.
I
the
didn't do that, by
career-
the way. Zoom did that on its
I didn't
own.
either. I don't know. It's just this AI stuff. I just don't understand it.
For those of you listening, some balloons just popped up because I think he celebrated his thing.
Yeah, I think that'll show up in the video. So it will show up in the video. Anyway, so that was sort of my big unlocking move. Yeah. So that was the trajectory.
Hey,
for the
Rob,
rest-
if you don't mind, I'd like to dive into that for two reasons. One is, are you a man of faith? Because that sounds like a God thing. And the other thing is, as you came across this, you put it out into the universe that you wanted to teach and you wanted to do venture capital, and the universe, paid it back or paid it forward to you. Talk to me about either one of those things.
Yeah. So I was raised in a heavy-handed Catholic family, and I rejected it simply because of the way it was presented to me. But I remain, faithful or spiritual or believing in a higher power. Absolutely. I think everyone's intentions are good. I don't know exactly which one I choose to believe in. But definitely I know there's a higher power out there, and definitely I'm very comfortable with all religions. It's interesting, of my two kids, one is highly religious and one has my view. So I've sort of got, the gene pool. About 50% of my family is highly religious. The other 50% is more spiritual than religious. So, but I do believe, it was a combination of visualization, preparation, and it provided me the motivation I need to, everyone asks, how do you get, a career in X or Y? Anyone who's intellectually honest knows they kind of just worked at it and it came to them, and it kind of came to me and I found it at the same time, if that makes sense.
It does. One thing that you said earlier that I want to come back to as well is you didn't take the highest paying job. You took the jobs that had perhaps some upside with the startup, and also a lot of learnings that were geared towards where you wanted to end up. So invest in yourself, not just with the cash, but with the opportunity.
Exactly. Where's the opportunity stream?
Let's go. That's worth the cost of this podcast for all of my listeners.
I'll tell you two quick stories on that front. So I had this job offer from a company called Lotus Development, and I had a job offer from a company called Wang Computer. And you remember, this was the 1980s and I was in my 20s. Wang Computer salesmen typically made about $250,000 a year.
Wow, that's probably $5 million in today's.
Yeah, exactly. So, and they, somehow they got in touch with me. I filled out or got interviewed. They had a shrink analyze me like they did all their people, and they were just after me like crazy. And at the same time, I had this job from this startup called Lotus Development in East Cambridge, working out of an old rope factory. And, I consulted with my parents, and they're like, oh, you're crazy to go with the startup. Take the Wang thing. Why wouldn't you? Anyway, I took the Lotus job. I think it was $50,000 or $60,000 a year at the time, which was substantial, but not $250,000, obviously. So interestingly, within a year, Wang was out of business, completely lock, stock, and barrel. If you remember that big crash and burn. And Lotus, I continued to make, move up the salary ranks, but also went public. And all of a sudden, I had significant stock options like everyone did. And it was like, wow. So I got more than compensated, even though I didn't go after compensation, if that makes sense. I've got one other interesting story on Lotus Development too.
Let's hear it.
I went into the VP of sales, a guy named Steve Crummy, who I still know. And I had actually worked previously for a company called Harris Corporation. I spent 2 years in technical sales. That's how I got qualified and into Lotus. I described that as my first job. Technically, it was my second job. So anyway, I had worked for this computer manufacturer that made a lot of IBM clone equipment, essentially. And Steve, I went and interviewed with Steve, and he said, I like everything about you, but you're too young to have had this experience. I just don't believe it. And I said, okay, so what can I do to convince you? He said, well, who's the biggest chief information officer you know? And it was a woman named Kathy Hudson at Kodak. And she was like, Kodak spent billions of dollars a year, literally billions with IBM at the time. Steve Crummy knew that. Anyway, so he goes, okay. I said, he said, I don't believe you know Kathy Hudson. I said, great. Can I borrow your phone? And I walked up. I remember it was a Roam phone, put it on speakerphone, dialed Kathy's number from memory, of course, I got her secretary, Jane, and I said, "Hey, Jane, is Kathy in?" And she goes, "Oh, hi, Rob. No, she's not in. I think she'll be back after lunch. Would you like me to have her call you?" I said, "No, that's okay. I'll just follow up next time I see her." And I looked at
Boom.
Steve, I said, "Okay, can I have the job?"
I,
So, so it was one of those, that's another bit of an unlocking move, those two stories. So,
I love it. That's definitely a drop the mic moment before dropping the mic was popular.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Hey, let's segue real quick because I want to cover what you're doing today. Because as we talked a couple of weeks ago, you're in the longevity space, and you want to try to bring some clarity, some simplicity, some cheat codes. There's so much information out there about how I can live longer and live healthier. Tell me what you're doing today.
Right, right. So first of all, just for clarity purposes, my full-time gig is still venture capital without question. But all my life, I've kind of been definitely an amateur athlete. I have a son who is a professional athlete, so I know all about that stuff. As I said, I was a rower in college. I was eligible for the Olympics the year Jimmy Carter canceled them. So, and I wasn't going to hang around another 4 years to see if I could do that. So, maybe a little bit of frustration there. But the good news was, sort of my college days and subsequent years, I managed to stay in reasonably good shape. And when I say that because, family man, career man, everyone goes through this. You have kids, you're trying to make, be as ambitious as you can in your career, spend as much time with your kids as you can. And also just not, as I would say, let your body go to pot, meaning not get too slovenly. So somehow I was able to hang on or maintain for a few decades. I've got pretty good genetics, that's just random luck, and I appreciate that I have them. But also, I mentioned earlier my rowing coach, Kevin Saar, who went on to coach at the University of Virginia and actually just retired recently. He was way ahead of the game. And, we were doing training like, pulse rate, breathing rate. We would take our pulse in the morning to see how recovered we were, cold plunges, oxygen deprivation, high altitude. We were doing all this stuff way back then. And honestly, it hasn't changed that much. But the thing on longevity that is just mind-boggling is everyone's trying to make money off it. Everyone's trying to sell you a supplement, sell you a gym membership, sell you a piece of training equipment, and it's just completely overblown. We've got people telling you that, Harvard MDs telling you that they've found the secret of, keeping you young. And there's just so much noise in the system. I'm trying to provide kind of common sense, almost a field manual of how to age with grace. And I talk to my peer group and my friends, and it's like, we're sitting around going, yeah, listen, if having a beer at night is going to take 15 minutes off my life, I'll have a beer or two if I want to. At the same time, what is it? Lounging is the equivalent of what smoking was. Processed food is becoming the equivalent of what smoking was. Alcohol is becoming the equivalent of what smoking was. And everyone's trying to cover it up and kind of hide it and, obfuscate it. So there's a whole lot of noise in the system. And I'm just trying to clarify as just a person with common sense and a vested interest in, maximizing health span. I don't care if I live to be 100 or not. As long as I can feed myself, I'll be satisfied. And I find most people pretty much have that attitude. And, the best example of the industry that's been built around it, and I think I mentioned this before, this Blue Zones thing has been around for about 10 years now. And the guy who did all the research really did a lousy job on the data, and now it's being discovered that all these blue zones are in fact places where birth certificates were burned or never formally, registered. Death certificates don't get issued when you bury grandma in the backyard. And by the way, the pension checks keep coming. So why am I going to tell the government of one of the islands in Greece, one of the islands in Italy, Okinawa, Loma Linda, California? It's all just bad data that has produced all these results. And if you follow it, it's slowly becoming more and more of a crescendo. So all I'm trying to do is cut through the noise and provide people sort of common sense information. Again, I call it a field manual that just says, hey, if you're going to exercise, here's the things to know. If you're going to take supplements, here's the things to know. Here's the difference between cardio and weight training. And anyway, just try to make common sense out of it.
Dude, sign me up, because as you know, you get inundated with all the different, fads and diets and supplements and tools that you need to buy and podcasts you need
Coffee's
to
good
watch.
for you. Coffee's bad for you. Eggs are good for you. Eggs are bad for you. Yeah.
Yes, if you could help me with that, I'm all in. Is that going to be in a podcast format, or what are you trying to sell me, Rob?
Yeah. Well, I'm not trying to sell you much, but what I think I'm going to, what I believe the right approach is going to be to publish a book, sort of with all the categorizations of all the different, areas of longevity and fitness you need to know about, put a framework out there, and then keep that framework updated. Obviously, the book wouldn't get updated as much as a newsletter or a podcast or a video, a YouTube channel. So base coverage would be through the book. So look for a book sometime in the next year or two. Then all the common media formats, again, podcast, YouTube video, newsletter, whatever, to update sections, because this is always evolving. There's new stuff found all the time. Another great example is studies on alcohol. The U.S. government, in its infinite wisdom, has determined that men can still have 2 drinks a night and women can have 1, and it's not going to hurt anybody. The World Health Organization, which, has its controversies in and of itself, has determined that actually the number is 0. So there's a dichotomy, and my intention would be to go in and try to give people the reasoning and the understanding of what each study says and why, versus the wine industry funding, research that says red wine is good for you, or something like that. So
do you have a name for it yet? What should we be looking for?
I have a few working names, a few URLs I've managed to grab. I think the one I like most at this point is Lifespan.agency, meaning, I have agency over my own lifespan. Okay. And it's a little newish and, avant-garde as far as wording and the URLs available and that kind of stuff, but we'll see. Always, as a software guy, we always had titles of, code names for stuff. And we tried various names before we came out with the final one. So I'm sure we'll go through that kind of iteration.
Perfect. Rob, I'd like to ask a question that is really appropriate for this time of the show, and I really like to ask it around this time of the show anyway, and that is, I consider myself the listener's advocate. If I've got Rob Adams here, one-on-one conversation, what would I want Kurt to ask? And the question is obvious. Tell me the top 3 things that you would tell somebody like me who wants to live a healthier, maybe longer, but definitely a healthier life, and cut through the clutter.
Yeah, well, so a couple of things are obvious, right? It's the bad habit syndrome, right? We know smoking's terrible for you. There's no excuse in the 21st century for anyone to smoke. We know processed foods are bad, and the more research is coming out, they're getting worse and worse. Now, listen, realistically, you still got to eat processed foods. If you're a business person, you still go on the road. You still have meals. You just got to be common sense, order salads, seafood, cut down on red meat, stuff like that. So there's some obvious things that, in some ways don't need to be restated, but in my experience, you always got to restate the obvious. So one is the obvious lifestyle stuff. Second thing is, and this has been proven time and time again, exercise is a key to longevity, okay? You got to get up off the couch. That could be as simple as walking. That could be as sophisticated as lifting weights. That could be anything in between, but you got to keep moving. You've got to find ways to stay active. And then the third thing is you got to be up on current research. There are some interesting drugs out there that do expand lifestyles. And there are people who write about it, and cover it. And, you can listen to well-researched results, but if you look at the supplement industry, it's not FDA regulated, and they can pretty much say anything they want. And, we all get hit on Facebook or in what we read that, oh, here's the newest nutrient, enzyme, peptide that, you're going to be a loser if you're not taking it, and your offspring are going to die young if you don't. I mean, it's just crazy the kind of claims that get made, and you just can't necessarily believe them. So in my experience, it's you just got to simplify your life. You got to try to drink water, not Coca-Cola kind of stuff. Get some exercise, and then pay attention to what's going on and pay attention to the research. Depending on how much of a professional athlete you want to be at this. I have all due respect for Peter Attia, who's a guy in Austin who is a MD with great credentials, who really does a great job on this stuff. But he's trying to get people to train at the professional athlete level. And I have certainly come close to that. But, in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, you do not want to train like a professional athlete. You just can't do it for that long, right? You professional athletes have limited lifespans. So you have to be realistic. And I find most people just want the common sense approach. Give me the top 3 things, which hopefully I've given you, although I need to articulate that better and turn it into book form for sure.
So I understand the 3 things. Let me ask you a different question. There are a lot of things out there that are wonder drugs, if you will. Things like cryotherapy, things like IV therapy, things like saunas and you name it. There's different things that are out there. Can you give 1 or 2 that you really appreciate yourself? Because you look like a guy, like I said, that's 45. And how old are you? 65?
Yeah, I guess I could kind of admit to that. Yes.
I mean, hell.
Okay, but listen.
What do you do, Rob?
Well, listen, the thing I'm working on right now is sleep. Okay. I'm always doing something. I've been back into rowing. I've done master's level rowing. Hey, I got lucky. I got some gold medals at the men's national competitions. Lately I've been into weights. I do a lot more weightlifting, less cardio, more weightlifting. In the past, I've done more cardio. Right now I'm working on sleep. Again, like as I'm aging, I'm finding good sleep, high quality sleep is more elusive. So that's kind of my current focus. But let's take cryotherapy. Okay. Cold showers have been around for centuries, right? Cold showers were something we knew in the 70s and 80s. Now you don't need a cold plunge pool for $1,000 in your backyard to take an ice bath. You just don't need it. And by the way, cold plunges are great, primarily for recovery reasons. It's a substitute for aspirin or, NSAIDs, non-steroidal. I can't remember what the rest of the acronym. And it's great, but you do not need $1,000 plunge pool to take an ice bath. You turn on cold water in your shower in the morning and stand there freezing for 2 or 3 minutes and you're done. Personally, I don't do that. I've never done it. I don't like it that much. But, again, I have a son who played in the NFL, and ice baths are part of the healing process after a game, every game, even if you're not hurt. So the benefits are tremendous. But again, I want to emphasize, you don't need a cold plunge pool to do it. Fill up your bathtub with ice and get in it as an example. Another example is the only medical proven way to extend life is calorie restriction. So if you are willing to put yourself on about 500 calories a day, the medical evidence is you will live longer. But I don't know that many people that are willing to, first of all, you can't make money selling that. So you don't hear much about it. Secondly, I don't know that many people, even if they are longevity freaks, that really want to survive on 500 calories a day, which I might point out to you is about 2.5 beers for those of you who, follow calories, right?
Yeah.
So again, my goal is to try to rationalize and standardize and get that kind of information out to people.
So it's not just longevity, it's living a healthy life and feeling good and all this stuff, not just living longer. That's
yeah, exactly. Longevity is just healthy lifestyle. The term people like to use is health span. Who wants to live to be 100? If you've been around any 100-year-old people, it's not a very pleasant lifestyle. So, health span is the term. And then everyone has it, just like everyone has a different IQ and everyone has a different SAT score. Everyone has a different health span. And the only realistic thing you can expect to do is maximize your own health span, given what genetics you're dealing with. So
like it. So as we're wrapping up here, Rob, I've got one more question for you. It's kind of a trick question. And that is, tell me one question that you're never asked and either you wish they would ask you or you're secretly glad that they don't.
I guess no one's ever asked me what's the most impactful, I hate that word impactful. What's the most significant experience of my life? Never been asked that.
Let's go. What is it?
It's going to be a little bit of an unusual answer. When I was a kid in grade school, my dad got transferred to Tokyo, Japan. And what my parents did, they were both, kind of children of the Depression. And they both appreciated what they had as American citizens. But what I saw firsthand was what it was like to live in, okay, so this was 1960s Tokyo, just 20 years out of World War II, still an underdeveloped country. And what they kind of said to my brother and sister and I was, this could just as easily have been you. And by the way, you were born into the best country ever. And it's not perfect. And there are going to be times you're going to be annoyed with what happens. But I want you to remember what you're seeing here for these, 3 or 4 years we were there. And I want you to burn it into your memory. And whenever you start feeling sorry for yourself, I want you to think about the people here. And, that kind of gave me what I like to call immigrant instincts. And, taught me complete appreciation, again, back to the spirituality, whatever you believe in, that, man, as far as I'm concerned, anyone fortunate enough to be an American won the lottery. And I've traveled the world since then. I've been to all continents except Antarctica, been just about everywhere. And, America, rightly or wrongly, I don't care what other people think. I know how I feel. It is the equivalent to anyone else in the world of winning the lottery.
Dude, that's powerful stuff. And I think we need to appreciate that.
Yes.
And know that we are fortunate where we are. And that with that comes a lot of responsibilities, of course, too. But I'm glad that you appreciated that. And that things aren't always going to go as you'd like. But man, the flip side is you could be in a lot of other places in a lot of other circumstances.
Exactly.
Gratitude. Gratitude is
Gratitude,
a
yes.
great word.
Appreciation. Absolutely, Kurt.
Hey, Rob, on that note, we're going to wrap this puppy up. I'm going to ask all of our subscribers to please go like and subscribe wherever you consume your podcasts, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You'll have the video version. And Rob, I can't thank you enough for being here and having a really authentic conversation about your past and present and your future.
Well, I enjoyed it. And obviously, send me the stuff and I'll circulate it as many places as I can. So,
Let's go. Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate it, man. If you're an entrepreneur and you think you might have outgrown a member of your team, or maybe you've got a mic, as we talked about in Who's Your Mic, check out this quiz at who'syourmic.com/quiz. That's who'syourmic.com/quiz.